Of Canadian Women in Cybersecurity 2021. Believe it or not, exactly 1 year ago, at this very time, we were in person at the Westin in downtown Toronto during this conference in its inaugural year. Over 1,000 attendees. Today, I'm humbled, thankful, and grateful that this conference has continued online with its message of inclusivity, hashtag #WeAreCyber, in a community that's now close to 2,500 people. Shout out to the team at Cyber Exchange, CEO Mahdi Raza, and everybody at his team, and the advisory board led by Kat Kood for making this conference happen despite all of the challenges. In keeping with the tradition of my panels that I've hosted for this conference, and in keeping with the theme, choose to challenge, in celebration of International Women's Day for a week-long celebration, I'm going to begin each of my panels by putting forward a challenge that I place before myself. Previous sessions I talked about privilege, I talked about diversity. Today, I choose myself to challenge myself rather to think outside of the box, burn that box if you will. You see, when it comes to cybercrime and fraud, we often think that we're not that big of a target. There are other fish out there that criminals might be looking to fry. My challenge to myself today is to realize that nobody is too small of a target. And it's important for all of us to make sure that we ourselves are being proactively secure, but also helping those around us, especially the disenfranchised, especially those who have been thrust into this virtual world like our seniors, and how we can help them and how I can help them stay cyber safe and cyber secure. My name is Abbas Hirji. I work at Durham College, both at the AI Hub and the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation, and you also know me as the host of the Power Hour. And our sponsors for this session, Kaspersky, are no need of an introduction, but more importantly than that, are a firm that has stood very strongly in educating the population on realizing what do we mean by fraud and cybercrime. Let's set some perspective for this panel. A couple of days ago, you would have seen an article in Toronto where the police has been warning us about a new and weird taxi scam. What's that scam all about? You see two taxi drivers arguing with one another. One a taxi driver, one a pretend passenger who's also a taxi driver. You find them arguing with one another, saying, "I will not accept fare in cash." A passerby walks by, says, "Hey, what are you arguing about?" and says, "Hey, I want to pay my fare, but the driver won't accept cash." The passerby, keeping with Canadian ethic and kindness, says, "Listen, I'll pay for you by card, just give me your cash." And when that transaction happens, in a matter of seconds, your credit card gets switched over for some similar looking credit card, you get a receipt, but you no longer have your original card. Now that those two taxi drivers have your original card, and your PIN number, thousands of transactions are realized because of that. It's with reason that they say that the dark web or cybercrime constitutes the third largest economy in the world. And I couldn't think of more well-versed, well-traveled, and well-thought-out individuals to discuss this topic for today. So thank you, Kaspersky, for making this happen. And I'm now going to dive into welcoming our panelists by asking them to introduce themselves in a little bit of a dynamic way. Let's start out first with Louise. Louise, can you introduce yourself? Where do you work? And why is cybercrime as a subject important to you? Louise.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Louise Dandonneau. I'm the VP of Cybersecurity Services at Scotiabank. I'm accountable for defending the bank and providing incident response for our employees and customers. And cybercrime is a problem that happens to all of us or can impact all of us. And certainly, being a bank, anything related to cybercrime, you would think that it's an easy link. But I think from my perspective, and really what we have as a bank and a banking organization is a fantastic platform as cybersecurity professionals in the banking industry to be the forefront of education. There are a lot of people that have bank accounts and a lot of people that have access to our services. So we have a very unique platform to educate our communities and our customers about cybercrime and how it impacts them. And I think that being a banker and being part of that community gives me that unique opportunity to give that element of education. So cybercrime is an issue that impacts us all, but I think from my perspective, the impact is one thing. We're really focused on how we can prevent as much as we can and leverage our access to individuals across Canada to do that.
Absolutely, and I think that proactive posture is something that I definitely want to engage with you on. I also think that the term that you used the word easy quite a bit. And yes, when we think of banking, when we think of our financial practice, it seems very easy. Pop up your app, put in your details, log in, and transfer money. But often it's the easy things that render the most difficult and challenging situations. And I'm glad that you also mentioned education because awareness is a huge piece of that. And I'm looking forward to diving into that with you. So, Louise, welcome. And I know this is your first exchange on the Cyber Exchange platform, but I know this is going to be the first of many. I'm going to go over to my colleague at Durham College as well as Ontario Tech, Sajeev. He's about 2 months old at our campus, but it looks like he's been here for a very, very long time because he's dived very deep into the work that we do. Sajeev, introduce yourself, your role at our campus, and why is this subject particularly important to you at this very time? Sajeev.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much for having me in this panel. I think it's a great opportunity for me to be part of this panel and be part of this discussion. So, hello, everybody. My name is Sajeev Vijayakumar. I am the Director of Information Security at Durham College and Ontario Tech University. So I've been, like Ali said, I'm fairly new to the role. I'm getting my feet wet in terms of the educational institution, but I've been in the industry for about 15 years, worked with various organizations, both private and public sectors. And in my experience, each organization, depending on the business they're in, they have a slight variation in terms of the measures that they take against cybersecurity and their overall approach towards cyber security and cybercrime, right? In the end, cybercrime is bad. Either you're an individual or an organization. Now, with the educational institution, I do see that managing cybersecurity is quite interesting and challenging. It's a challenging undertaking. The reason being is that higher education, we're an open environment. So our goal is to sort of teach and share information. It's a very collaborative platform. So, providing that constant uninterrupted access to the internet really helps us achieve that goal. But at the same time, we are responsible for the traffic that we're generating on our network
Mm-hmm.
and the data that we're sharing, and the controls that goes around the overall network. So it is clear that threats facing businesses will extend beyond our network perimeter and move beyond our network perimeter. So moving towards more of a human-centric approach to cybersecurity is required, and I think that's the only way we can go protect our critical assets and compromise. I think we have to kind of take a unique approach to this. We have to. It's not. This is not a work that's going to be done in silos. Like IT services is the main sort of unit that's protecting the overall security. So I think it's a sort of a multiple disciplines type of undertaking. We have to work with our IT services. We have to work with our HR, our legal department, our students. So we have to engage a lot of organizations to actually be a sort of a well-performing organization and be a security to improve our security posture. So I think by getting together with those teams, looking at applying sort of well-tested findings and research combined with sort of engaging security awareness programs and training programs is the key to sort of creating that functional, that secure, that transformational organization.
Absolutely. And Sajeev, I think you've absolutely nailed it. When you said the aspect of, this is not something that we can look at in silos. Often you and I have joked about the fact that, you want to go fast, you go alone. You want to go faster, you bring your crew. And I can tell you this to our audience that Sajeev has certainly brought a crew around him, not just technical specialists in security, but individuals such as the teams at Kaspersky, individuals such as myself, other faculty members to have a conversation. And I want to get into those pieces around awareness programming and how these shift in the banking sector versus the public sector and education as well. So thank you, Sajeev, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you very much for choosing to join our institution. It's already made a lot of impact, although you're just 2 months old. Claire, all the way in the UK. I know COVID does not allow us to cross borders right now, but thanks to technology, I can teleport over to you. Claire, thank you so much. I know this is your first engagement on the Cyber Exchange platform. I'm humbled to have you join us, and I'm sure this will be the first of many. Claire, introduce yourself, your role, and tell us one thing about the world of cybercrime and fraud that particularly intrigues you. Claire.
So I'm Claire Hatcher. I am Global Head of Fraud Prevention at Kaspersky. So we work with not only banks, but also online retailers and governments to ultimately protect citizens and consumers against fraud in the online and mobile space. I've been in the fraud prevention world from a vendor's perspective for about 15 years now. I genuinely still get excited about what I do. Obviously, there's the obvious side of things, that cybercrime, it affects us all. People can often think of it as almost like a victimless crime because you don't actually see the face of it. But that's, as I'm sure Louise will tell you, it's so not true. There's people's hard-earned savings, lifetime savings that can be extorted. And yeah, it's something that we absolutely need to protect our sort of older and younger generation against. And I find it a fascinating world to be in. So I genuinely enjoy looking at the patterns to see how fraud emerges, something that you said, Ali, about it doesn't operate in silos. So you can see that fraudsters look for the loopholes. They're looking to see, how can we find an anomaly? How can we find a gap in the process to ultimately steal credentials, steal money? And I genuinely really enjoy finding those patterns and finding those anomalies and see how we can plug those gaps.
Absolutely. In preparation for this session, I was speaking to a mentor of mine from Waterloo North Hydro, Mark Dillon, who's actually going to be on a session after this on SolarWinds. And he said, when it comes to cybercrime, everybody comes to you and says, hey, tell me the truth about this. And he said, they're not truths. It's all interpretation. It's how you interpret the data and how you understand it, knowing that it can constantly move. And I really want to get into that piece as well, because what was previously not a target now has become a target. And with the depth of the perimeter, I think there's a lot of analysis we can draw from you. So Claire, thank you so much. And to our audience, I will also advise you, if you want to get in touch with Team Kaspersky, there is a group that currently exists on cyberexchange.ca. You can reach out to Randy, Claire, the rest of the members of their team, Tanya, Greg, Nishma, wonderful individuals, always willing to share. So thank you so much, Claire, for joining us. And last but not the least, someone who's been a really good friend to me and really helped me hone in on my ability to also run some of these sessions. Captain Randy, as I like to call him. Introduce yourself, the role that you play, and building on what Claire said, what do you think is one of the most fascinating pieces on the subject that we're discussing today? Randy?
Thanks, Ali. Always generous with your introduction. I really appreciate it. And on a personal note, when I'm thinking about cybercrime and cyber fraud, it really makes me mad. I grew up watching and reading science fiction. I was into the nerd stuff before the nerd stuff was cool. And, as a kid, I really bought into the idea that technology can help us unlock human potential. And when you look at what cyber fraudsters and cyber criminals do, they're really taking this gift of technology and turning it against us. And that can derail the progress that we're making, as technology professionals and as a society. So, part of why, I pursued cybersecurity as a career, and part of why I joined Kaspersky specifically is because I believe we need to work together to put a stop to this and to really build a safer world. And when you look at Kaspersky, that is their mission statement, building a safer world. And, you know, a lot of companies have mission statements, but when you look at our founder, Eugene Kaspersky, and actually see, you know, where he puts his time and energy, you know, he's really living that statement. And that's why, you know, I enjoy working with Kaspersky so much.
Absolutely. You know, I've said this before. It's not about the plan, it's about planning. It's not about the build, it's about building. You need to know that these processes in cybersecurity are not products, they are processes. And I think with Team Kaspersky, what our audience will realize very quickly is the way in which they've understood that process. I really also appreciate the way in which there's a feedback loop with Team Kaspersky. Because when we get into the AI components of how anomalies are detected or how threat intelligence is parsed through, that feedback loop and false positives have a huge implication on the kind of decisions that we make and the switches, for example, that we switch off or the devices that we throw off of our networks. So we'll dive deep into that. But the first question that I have, I'm going to help our audience understand what do we mean by cybercrime and fraud to begin with. Now, the easiest lies are the lies that we tell ourselves and then we end up believing them. Many folks tend to equate cybercrime and fraud simply with, yep, money's been siphoned off of my account. But it's a lot more denser than that and a lot more intricate than that. Claire, if we can start off with you, can you help our audience understand what do we mean by cybercrime and fraud from your perspective? Claire.
Yeah, so it's absolutely not just about money that's being stolen. It's theft of any kind of commodity or personal information. It's one of those fallacies that fraud is just about money and therefore it's just something that's targeted at banks. So when you think of the industries that are targeted, yes, banks will always be a huge target for cyber criminals. But when you look at the research, it's actually been online retail that's been the number one in terms of growth rates for fraud over the years. And it's actually some research pointing to the fact it might be number one in terms of target. So when you think about the cyber criminals, and if you think about them as almost like a pyramid of the layers of who's involved in that, you might have at the bottom layer like the opportunists, you know, the people you think of like the hackers, that just the individuals trying to get a little bit of money for themselves. And then above that, you'll have criminal gangs, criminal organizations that's much more organized, and then even up to sort of nation state level, you know, people. But all of them are actually trying to monetize the theft of information in some way. They're all trying to do that in order to profiteer from that information for their own means. So we shouldn't think about fraud just in terms of money, but also in terms of any information that could be stolen and what that means to you. So if you think about in your personal life, you might be an online gamer and how much your online avatars or points are worth to you.
Interesting.
Or for me, obviously pre-pandemic, I was somebody that traveled a lot. My loyalty points for airlines and hotels are worth a lot to me. What would happen if somebody siphoned those off out of my account and then obviously used them for their own travel means? It's anything can be monetized is essentially the message. That
Absolutely. I think that needs to be something we put on a shirt where you said anything can be monetized. Now, I've often said this in previous sessions that it is about data. You've heard other folks talk about data as the new currency. Eric O'Neill, for example, brought that up repeatedly. And I've often said this is that if you really want to understand cybercrime and fraud, you need to know data. And the real dangerous folks with data, and dangerous can be good or bad, the real dangerous ones with data are the ones who are good storytellers. The more data you get, the more narrative you can build, the more access you can suddenly build into different environments and pretend to be someone who you're actually not. So thank you for emphasizing on that piece of data. Randy, I want to bring you back into the conversation and then go to Louise and Sajeev. Randy, I don't know how far this is true, but they say, right, to catch a thief, you've got to act like a thief. From an intelligence perspective, how do you structure your environments to know what you're looking for in order to detect that, hey, something sinister could be happening here? Could you shed some light on the threat intel and the Kaspersky lab practices that have put you so forward in the market? Randy?
Yeah, when it comes to threat intelligence, they say, in order to be successful in a campaign, you have to know your enemy.
Yep.
But in addition to that, you really need to know yourself. So when we work with organizations in structuring a threat intelligence program, that's really where we start. Know yourself, know your industry, know your standing within the industry, and that's going to give you an idea of where you might be on a threat actor's priority list. And then start with some of the data that you have that could actually be mined for intelligence yourself. The different pieces of information that you're collecting within your organization before you start thinking about outside sources of threat intelligence to bring in. And when you make that next step of investing in more intelligence, it should really be to kind of complete and augment, the data that you're collecting yourself. So understanding, what's out there, the emerging threats as things are changing, it's really important to get that information. But with threat intelligence programs, sometimes less is more, because we hear so much about the false positives, the alert fatigue, all of those things that can really make a program go sideways. So being able to collect the context to the information so that you understand what to pay attention to and what to kind of lower your priority with, because it's easy to get overwhelmed and let fear, uncertainty, and doubt kind of creep in when you're consuming this information. So what we do as we help organizations structure those threat intelligence programs is help newer organizations understand that context, and larger organizations who may already have a robust threat intelligence programs. We look for areas where we can complement and where some of our unique differentiators, such as the areas of the world where we're able to collect telemetry data and align that to emerging threats, can really help their programs. And for organizations that are just starting to consume threat intelligence, we can do things such as augment their current staff with a managed threat hunting service, so that we can provide them, not only the intelligence and the context, but trained professionals who can help monitor what's going on in their environment 24/7. So that it's all about lowering the time to discovery and the time to action.
Absolutely. And you know what, we spoke about this in our power hour as well, where intelligence will tell you need to build a home, innovation will tell you the exact way you need to build that home to stay secure and safe. And I do want to get into this pieces around deployment of threat intel, not just the AI elements, but also the timeliness of it. When can a Kaspersky solution be applied, and what kind of alerts do you start receiving once the solution is in action? So we'll come to that as we browse through this conversation. Very good bridge to bring Louise back into the discussion. Louise, we say forewarned is forearmed. Let's say, you're studying the patterns of 100 users and you think you've got it down to a science. There's always that 101st user that brings something else into the picture. Can you give us a sense of, from a banking perspective, what are some of the elements that you start noticing that have become a part or are the ingredients for cybercrime? It's not just, as Claire had mentioned, somebody taking your credit card and spending it other ways. There are other things that you look for to detect that a crime or a piece of fraud might be in the works. Can you shed some light on this, Louise?
Yeah, certainly. And building exactly on what Claire and Randy had mentioned, right? So we do have to remind ourselves that these organizations that are doing these things are very well organized, but do not need to operate like the rest of us. They don't have an internal audit group. They don't have to do their change requests and follow the process. They move so agile, right? And what happens is that when you're looking at the pattern, you kind of get into the pattern, and it's important that you take that step back. And when Randy mentions your threat hunting point, I think that that's a really great opportunity to really see that 101st element. So you leverage your detections based on your patterns. Every day you're looking at what you know, whether it be, validation of a piece of malware that might be in play, or just even looking at applications and those kinds of data points. But then building on some of the practices that you have with that threat hunting team within your organization, who are really aimed at looking for that new pattern or that 101st or the early thread. So sometimes we detect patterns once the pattern has achieved 10 or 15 or 20. And sometimes if you leverage that threat intelligence linked with that hunting capability within your organization, you might see that pattern much earlier. At least that's what you aim to do with that component. So you have to be mindful that the fraudsters and those that are trying to affect cybercrime have capabilities that never were before available to them. The as-a-service capabilities that they have now, that they can just go and buy what it is that they want to do, or even, just pick it up off of the dark web. So remembering that they're agile and they're fast and they have the as-a-service capabilities, and then remembering that patterns are important, but that you must have some corresponding processes in your organization, like threat intelligence, like threat hunting, that help give you that number one or that extra, that early detection of a new pattern, or the next new pattern, if you will.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate this aspect where you've highlighted the fact that there's a lot of knowledge to be shared, even if you're using tools like Kaspersky, etc., where you can get lots of feeds, lots of data, and see lots of things that are happening. Knowledge is power, they say, but power can destruct or construct. How you act on that knowledge, what systems do you activate, who do you inform within the organization, all can have a bearing on how you shape your threat intel practices and how you shape your responses to when cybercrime or when fraud is actually taking place or about to take place. So I really appreciate your posture when it comes to proactive security, and I'm going to unpack that just a little bit as we move along in the conversation. Just with that and working with those elements of user behavior, I want to bring Sajeev back into the conversation. Back when I was a student, I still am a PhD candidate, but I guess this holds true even now. I often would joke that, hey, if a cyber criminal was to come into my account saying they're here to look for some money, I'd join them to help them find it because I don't know where it is. Often we tend to think that, hey, we're not that much of a big of a target. Sure, let's focus in on students as a major chunk of the Canadian population and a huge economic driver for us. Often, not a lot of money in the accounts, depends, but there are other things that can happen from a fraud perspective, especially because of their IDs, especially because of identities, everything else tied to identity like SIN numbers, so on and so forth. Can you help us expand the horizon a little bit more and show us what does fraud and cybercrime look like in our environment at the college? Sajeev?
No, that's a great question, Ali. Yeah, you're exactly right. Students don't really think the importance of the cybercrime, cybersecurity, because they're in that stage of life. They are sort of working with their friends, and the school is just a different environment altogether, right? Now, from a sort of a security perspective, I've been hearing in terms of technology, what we're putting in place, we're following industry, best practices in terms of how we're securing our environment. So, starting with sort of defense and depth strategies. We're also looking at zero trust concepts. We've actually done the enterprise in a way that, the enterprise is supposed to be set up. We have, DMZs, we have all the perimeter securities with firewalls, IDS, IPS, and a whole bunch of stuff in. But the problem is that we also have sort of threat intelligence with the SIM platform, SolarWinds, and we have EDR platforms, CrowdStrike. So we are well protected from that perspective. But the major sort of difference that I see between sort of educational systems and other enterprises is that sort of approach towards security. I know we take it a little bit more easy. The time and time again, we do see phishing attempts, spear phishing, social engineering. That's something that's very prevalent with colleges because we are students of, they love to collaborate on different platforms. There's Instagram, Twitter. Then we are pretty much open because we do kind of let them do that as well. So we want to have various platforms where students collaborate. So what I'm saying is that, for me, the primary, my concern is that the awareness training for the students must be in a way that's engaging. It should be something that they should be involved in. So that training programs and phishing campaigns is something that I'm very heavily involved in. Although technical aspects are there, the prevalent sort of pattern that I see is towards student, and they're, just simple as having a password policy set up and enforce that, giving them some, guidance around that, and making sure that they're given that BYOD is a huge sort of push in our college. We want to make sure that they're updated in terms of the devices they're using, the devices that are getting connected to the network, and just overall, just staying abreast of what's happening in the industry, in security, right? And we also want to have them sort of approach cybersecurity. If something were to happen, what is our response plan? Who are they supposed to contact? The incident response policy, security breach policy. So all that stuff is something that we want to educate the students on. And the first level of support is what I'm kind of focusing on in terms of the college, from a cybersecurity perspective. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think this philosophy that you've imbibed very strongly in us is that no one individual is a self-sustaining island. There has to be a team approach to this. So each department having communications around this, and more importantly, I think Sajeev, really crucial is your work also with the wider Ontario community through the OnCheck program as an example. Farooq Nair, the
Exactly.
CISO for OnCheck, also moderating a couple of sessions tomorrow and Friday. That leadership around bringing different CISOs and CIOs to the table to discuss awareness programming, to discuss not just the technology piece, but the people and the process piece, people, process,
Yep.
technology, has actually helped us gain a bit of a better posture province wide. Sajeev, a question did come in about social engineering, which I'll come to a little bit later on, but thank you,
Okay.
Sajeev, for your perspective. Claire, I'll come to you and then go to Randy, and I'm going to weave in a question that has come in. And this is, I think it may also apply a little bit to Louise, so we'll go Claire, Randy, and then go to Louise. Claire, this is a question which I'm going to reword, so thank you to the audience member for directly messaging this to me. The question says, look, if I can reword it just a bit, it's, we live in a society where we place a premium on speed. We want people to have access almost right away. And I've always said we place a premium on speed, but the truth of the matter is it's priceless when you think about speed with protection and speed with direction. Can you give us a bit of a sense of the Kaspersky toolset and the stack that comes with trying to identify threat intels or trying to develop threat intel and identify cybercrimes and fraud? What does it work like? How do you deploy the Kaspersky set? Walk us through that life cycle and whether at all it can cause disruptions to the core operations of an organization.
Yes, a really good question. Considering that, as you say, everything we do now, it's all about speed, ease of access, especially when we're doing anything online or on a mobile device. The moment you're interrupted in your journey, the moment that something becomes difficult, maybe you have to put in an additional authentication code or something, like if security becomes burdensome, we can switch off, and then we sort of maybe go to a different provider in the case of online retail that makes it easier for us. So in terms of fraud prevention, because that's where I sit, and Randy might talk a little bit more about threat intel. Everything we do is in real time. So we collect all of the data from mobiles and the online sessions as well. And we analyze it across multiple different parameters, which we consider as device identifiers, behavioral biometrics, behavior in the environment, as well as looking to see if there's any malware as well on those devices. And we put all of that information together in order to create risk scores, because if one thing has changed, so say if I decide I'm going to start using a VPN, there could be a completely legitimate reason that I might be using a VPN. Some of my colleagues do, because that's what they do in their particular countries for privacy concerns. But obviously using a VPN could sometimes raise a red flag, as if to say something bad's happening here. But it's not necessarily just that one indicator. But if we look at if there's been some sort of fast travel, or my device or browser changes, or if I had been using my mobile phone, holding it in my left hand and typing with my right, and then all of a sudden it's in my right hand and I'm typing with my thumb, it's indicative that something has changed. So we can raise the scoring, we can create incidents that can ultimately plug into SIEMs and make sure that if we're pretty confident that something bad is happening, then we can put a block on that session, and sort of prevent something further from happening. And I think that's something that's really critical, actually now when we're looking at more, there's, as we sort of said, there's there's technology, process, and people, and likewise, when you look at the attack vector, there's ways in, and often the human is the way to get the money out. Social engineering is increasing massively, and when we see indicators that social engineering is taking place, we want to be able to make a stop on that in real time, because that's critical to preventing fraud in the world that we now live in.
I think that perspective that you provided truly phenomenal and a testament to the intelligence that works within the team at Kaspersky, and especially the reliance on human intelligence, but also artificial intelligence, really telling us that there's nothing artificial about the intelligence at Kaspersky. Thank you so much for that perspective. I also feel that to our audience, you need to pay attention to something that Claire said, whether you're in the space of threat intel or even somebody that is managing an organization where this is a conversation. The threat intelligence approach and the fraud approach that Kaspersky is taking is not about just looking at different things. There's a balance that they're striking, looking at different things, but also looking at the same things differently. That piece that Claire mentioned about whether you're using your right hand towards your left hand, all of this builds up a story. And that takes me back to Randy, because here's the question that I have for you. In terms of the tech stack that Kaspersky utilizes, a very specific one when it comes to fraud and cybercrime, etc. There's actually even a white paper, so to our audience, I'll make sure to post that in the live chat. There's a ticker running below, but it'll also give you links to some of those white papers. Can you help us understand, Randy, a little bit more about some of the controls that you have in place? I know there's an emphasis on MFA, there's an emphasis on being able to authenticate and re-authenticate users, but there are other areas as well that you have certain controls that you've established in your tech stack. Can you help us understand how an organization can leverage your tools in order to activate something in the event that the intelligence indicates that something sinister could be happening? Andy?
Yeah, and actually I'm thinking of a specific example where we helped someone who was a potential customer and became a new customer in just that type of situation. And when it comes to our threat intelligence offerings, we offer a wide assortment of integrations into the existing tools that organizations are already using. Everything from integration into a tip, a SIM or a SOC. We can deliver through our taxi server. There's different ways that we can kind of present this intelligence so that it's consumable and right away augments the tools that our customers already have in place. With one particular prospect that we were working with last summer, large manufacturing, multinational corporation, as soon as they started consuming our threat intelligence, they detected something. During the POC, something that was attributed to a fairly complex advanced persistent threat, but in the early stages, there didn't appear to be any damage done yet. It was a new threat that was there. So working with our team, once they got the alerts, they turned to us for some advice on, how do we remediate this, and we were able to help them with that. And I think that's really the where we find the most success is when we're able to augment someone's security posture without any disruption. Leveraging those tools that they already have, just making what they have better. And we're able to do that on the threat intelligence side, but also on the endpoint side as well. If someone, obviously, if they're moving from one endpoint vendor to us, there's a little bit of a minor project to switch over. But once they have our basic endpoint, they're able to move up from your traditional endpoint protection up to an EDR solution, and even start managing, leveraging our managed threat hunting service through our Optimum Security offering, all more or less hitting a switch, building off of what is already installed and just opening up, some additional features and, creating a little bit safer environment, with each transition. So, that's more or less our approach, that interoperability, that integration, and it's something that we do fairly well now, but we're always looking for new ways to improve so that as our customers move in another direction and look for other ways that they can improve their posture, we're ready to go right there with them.
Absolutely. And I think, to our audience that's listening, that white paper that I was referencing, highly recommend that you read it. There's also a subject there that's called greater authentication, pointing back to what Randy was talking about, is that not only are you looking at where somebody's doing their banking from and the timelines within, let's say they switched from one location to another or one device to another, there's also the patterns of the transactions themselves. Besides the patterns of the transactions, it's the types of requests that are being made. There's a whole story that has to be built that creates that narrative. And I highly recommend to our audience to read that white paper. At the Power Hour, while I said it facetiously, I do mean it, that when you talk about the key to your security being Kaspersky, there's a lot of key data points that you can take from that to determine how you want to select a threat intel package when it comes to understanding cybercrime and fraud. Working on understanding cybercrime and fraud just a little bit more, Louise, a question has come in which I truly appreciate, and hats off to the individual who asked this. And Louise, the scenario that's being painted is, hey, the way we look at cybercrime or fraud, we look at it as one or a group of evil actors going after one or a group of unsuspecting individuals. However, when it comes to cybercrime, there's also money laundering. There's also other activities happening between criminal organizations. What's your perspective on that, and how do you approach that? I hate to say it, but a very active and a very growing marketplace of money laundering, especially in light of the pandemic. Louise?
Yeah, that is an amazing question, and I am proud to say how much work our anti-money laundering teams are able to do with just crime in general, cyber, just anything to do with how we are able to detect the movement of money and the unfortunate movement of people as well, and be part of an industry that shares and collaborates that type of information with law enforcement, etc. I think the important part of being a large organization is that foundationally, everybody speaks a different language, right? My fraud department and I don't talk the same words sometimes. Nor does my AML team and I talk the same words. And I think it's important that, there are a few things that happen, right? One is you just listen. Introduce yourself to the other departments that play a role in cybercrime and do those one-on-one interactions, whether it be just learning the business of anti-money laundering. So for us in cybersecurity, when it comes to incident response, we spend a lot of time with our AML colleagues just learning what it is that they do, learning how their processes work, and how we can have a good collaboration between the two. We do the same with our fraud colleagues, but it's important to just understand that I can't apply what I do from a cybersecurity standpoint to my colleagues in AML. We have different mindsets, we have different accountabilities, and we have different roles. But what ends up happening is that as you partner together and you learn about what each other does, then you find those integration points. Sometimes when we're developing processes, certainly as we're trying to address cybercrime as a problem, right? We think of it because it has the word crime, that belongs to, those in your organization that deal with law enforcement directly. And they absolutely, I'm not going to tell you that that's not true, but what I am going to tell you is that everybody has a role to play, and you don't have to look very hard to find the areas that you can dovetail together. And it's rather than standing up independent processes in between each of your groups that have accountabilities, it's important to find how you can just find an easy transition between the two. Sometimes it's just as simple as including another area on a communication that's already been being done as part of a standard process, and they look at your process with new eyes, and that gives them, oh, hey, look, we've been dealing with this particular issue with, for an AML example, right? We've identified this certain group that we've been dealing with, and now you've provided us with a little bit of threat intel that shares that information point. So it's really just about collaboration internally that certainly helps from that perspective, and really understanding that it's a collective problem. Not one person owns it, right? Everybody has a role to play. And if you can come to the table with an open mind, I think that you'll get much more benefit in terms of moving that dial forward.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate the fact that you've stated this as a reality. This is the nature of the field that we're in. I've said this many times when lecturing on this subject that look, wars can begin when you like, but they often don't end when you choose. Simply because once you've entered into this space where you are engaging in financial transactions, where you have digital IDs, etc., this is a reality that you're going to have to contend with. And I appreciate the fact that you've not only just looked at the technology architecture of things, secure DevOps, which is a very fundamental practice and process at Scotiabank. I had some of my students who have interned there as well. Secure DevOps is now it's basically the way in which you do dev, but there are other elements of this as well, and I want to work on those other elements to bring Sajeev back into this conversation, because there's a question that's coming around social engineering. Before I do that, just for our audience, I also invite you can Google it up, the Caribbean bank attacks. I'm sure all of you, the cyber gang that launched a lot of the attacks, I believe it was in sort of in the EU kind of locale, targeting different banks. I highly recommend to look at an infographic that was released by Kaspersky. And if you take a look at it, you'll notice the time within which cybercrime and fraud was committed. Over about 6 to 8 months of intelligence gathering from the bad actors, with a heavy influence on social engineering to find that one weak link within the bank. So drawing from that social engineering piece, Sajeev, I want to bring you back to the conversation. Social engineering ultimately allows us or permits us to sort of give away information without even acknowledging it, without even knowing that you've done it. For example, you see on Twitter, and this happened a lot in the early days of the pandemic, where to facilitate engagement between faculty, between academics, somebody would tweet, hey, list your first 5 jobs, and then everybody would list it and then tag somebody else. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're trying to spread an awareness around social engineering, but also how are you monitoring for trends in what is really a tricky environment to gather intelligence on? Chief.
Absolutely. No, social engineering is a tough one, right? So like you said, the perfect example is list the last 5 jobs that you've held, and chances are that one of the security questions that you have talks about exactly that. Like, so it is a tough one. So from a social engineering perspective, what we're doing now is we as part of the awareness and training program, we do cover social engineering in great depths. We do look at current trends, and we are working with sort of organizations that have very rich material around social engineering, and we're making it sort of mandatory for the students to look at. And my sort of whole take on the social engineering is that it is very prevalent in the industry, and with the students it happens all the time, given that they're very active in all these platforms. So social engineering tactics, it all starts with the awareness program, and I want to really increase the frequency of those programs that we're giving to our students, and making them, and to some extent to make it sort of mandatory and have them follow and complete, and sort of an attestation or an agreement that they've completed those programs. But social engineering is a very tough one to sort of look at and keep abreast of, because there's different ways and different tactics that are followed every single day. Things are changing. The threat landscape is changing constantly. So that is a pretty tough one that we want to stay ahead of from a school perspective.
I don't say it without reason that the S in Sajeev stands for smart. Because truly, when you're truly smart, when you know that you're not as smart as you thought you were. And I think this aspect of being constantly on your toes, knowing that the bad actors out there are constantly motivated by something differently, acting differently, is truly the right posture that you need to take. So thank you, Sajeev, for that perspective. We've got about 12 more minutes left and a series of questions. I'm going to ask my esteemed panelists to take about a minute and a half each with their responses, so we can go through one more quick round and then concluding comments. Claire, let's come to you. And this is a question that's come in, not specific to the banking sector, but specific to any sector that might use a Kaspersky product for their threat intel to protect their clients, to protect their users who are either spending money in their environments or holding their money and investments in a particular environment. Once a threat is detected, or once something sinister is posited, how do you advise your clients with the steps that they need to take? How do you tell them that they need to? Do you tell them very directly, shut off these accounts or switch off these ports? How do you activate that intelligence process? Can you give some commentary on that?
Yeah, so because of the nature of the organizations that we work with that might have 50,000 plus users, they might even have several million users, there's naturally there isn't a way that you can manually phone up, the government organisation or the online retailer to say, hey, we've seen this, take action on it. So what we have is an interface where we create the level of risk and we define what those incidents are, so that if they are of a certain level, they can be automatically blocked, or likewise they can sort of take action to say, yeah, we want, if it's medium risk, to allow it to go through, we'll deal with it afterwards. And we sort of identify that in really plain language. So something Louise said about everyone talking different languages. I know I'm guilty of it. I've worked in fraud prevention for 15 years. You need to have terminology that makes sense to anyone who's operating in those systems. And then I think what then happens is later on, you need to look at collectively those incidents to say, right, your organization is being targeted with a particular social engineering campaign. What can we do to adapt those rules to take action to protect your users against that particular type of threat? And so the system can learn and feedback accordingly.
Absolutely, and I think this is extremely important for our audience that's listening to this as well. And I invite you to spend some time with Team Kaspersky, because there's also ramifications for the types of decisions that you make. Ultimately, like I said, people place a premium on speed and access. When you disrupt that access, there is an impact to the bottom line. There is an impact to how the organization continues to perform its functions, and that's a risk register subject that we can perhaps discuss at another time. But thank you, Claire, as always, for very clarified and clean responses. I really appreciate staying true to the ethos at Kaspersky. Captain Randy, this one was a question that I knew was going to come, and you've heard me say this before, that we all look at the fires outside of the building and say, oh, we're safe, and we ignore the smoke within. Insider threats, cybercrime, and fraud. We're busy looking at what people are doing outside and how people are acting on our networks, but what about what's happening within the organization? How does Kaspersky shed an optic on that?
Good question, really good question. And immediately I thought of the supply chain attack that has been in the news so much recently, associated with SolarWinds. Really, how that was uncovered, it wasn't through your traditional cybersecurity threat hunting. It was a different type of risk management that got involved around account creation. So it kind of aligns, and what we talk to organizations about is, the cybersecurity posture that you take is really just one piece of the puzzle. When it comes to addressing risk and having the right checks and balances and processes in place is so critical, because these attacks are becoming more and more complex, and these sophisticated threat actors know how to operate within a system in such a way that they elude detection. They stay very quiet, moving laterally, unlocking doors, for future access. And sometimes it's some of those more traditional risk assessment processes, those fundamentals that, under times of stress, times of change, unusual times like what we've endured for the past year, that those fundamentals get dropped. So understanding risk and looking for, because eventually the threat actor is going to do something that raises a red flag. And it's just paying attention to what might be, quiet smoke signals happening in different areas of your environment, being able to correlate those things and then compare that with some threat intelligence that tells you, how some of these threat actors have operated in the past, and see if through that correlation, there really is smoke here.
Absolutely, and I think that point that you mentioned about the times that we find ourselves in, different motivations, employees at some cases worried about their job security, some folks worried about sustaining their livelihoods, etc. The temptation of doing something which can give you instant reward can drive a lot of folks. So to that point, again, to our audience, highly recommend again spending some more time with the Kaspersky team, because of how you understand the positioning of your staff as well, the positioning of your team, and knowing where those fractures may be that could be utilized in different ways. There's a psychology to all of this, which I highly recommend that you engage deeper with the team at Kaspersky. 5 more minutes, and a question has come in. I'll go to Louise, and then Sajeev, Claire, Randy will go, and Louise will then go to some concluding comments. And of course, the audience is welcome to interact with you separately as well. Louise, I'll throw this question at you, but Sajeev, I'd also like your perspective here too. I'll read the question verbatim. It says, would you suggest to limit the amount of data you have on LinkedIn, for instance? I use them because it is so much detailed than a Twitter account, for instance. How much do you put out there? Some advice, Louise, on that.
Ooh, that is a great question, because it's the million-dollar question, really. How much data do you put out there? How do you balance the purpose of the platform that you're putting your information out there, LinkedIn being just one of them, and how much data they capture in relation? So when we think about LinkedIn, initial purpose, 100% help you with your career, right? But also, great spot for data mining. And there's other platforms as well, right? We talk about, even just now, WhatsApp and its linkage to Facebook, and we talk about some of the other, platforms that you just put in your email and you create an account and you don't think much of it, and life moves on. And the answer to the question is, it's difficult. It's difficult to answer that question, and I'll tell you why. Because on one hand, your data is out there somewhere, right? LinkedIn's already been breached once, right? Well, breached your account information again. Don't quote me on stuff. But your data's out there once already, right? At least the number of organizations, the number of places now where email addresses aren't sacred anymore. They used to be. So I always say this to the answer to that question, which is, be mindful. If the data that you are putting into a system is data that you've never put anywhere, then that's yours and you might want to keep it. Yeah. If it's I'm Pokemon Queen of the World at hotmail.com and it's everywhere, go nuts, right? But I think the challenge that we have is the pause. Absolutely. If you're registering for these systems, so I'm not going to say do or do not. I'm going to say do with intent. Be mindful. Take a moment to think. Just don't register for the sake of registering. Just don't put for the sake of put. Be mindful when you do it. Do it with intention. If you are doing it with intention, then you can keep yourself safe.
Oh, fantastic. And I really appreciate that perspective. I also saw Sajeev and Randy having a bit of a smile on the email comment, because their email addresses were toocoolforlife@hotmail.com. And Randy agrees and Sajeev agrees too. I would love to continue this conversation. There is one last question. I'm going to go to Sajeev. Sajeev, I'll give you 30 seconds and then we'll come to concluding remarks. And Sajeev, building on what Louise said as well, from an educational perspective as well, given the pandemic, have you seen that the pandemic has accelerated a new type or a new wave of cybercrime? Or to quote the question that's come in, is cybercrime the silent pandemic we have not been talking about? Sajeev.
No, so the pandemic, undoubtedly, it has caused some rapid and universal disruption, right, across business on a global stage. It has been impacting economies and leaving some companies even struggling to maintain their sort of business continuity, right? And it left all of us increasingly somewhat sort of vulnerable to cyber criminal activity. I feel like the pandemic has sort of exponentially grown the threats that are out there. So given that we're all working from home, it's not the traditional office space, which we have a lot of measures in place. So working from home, that has really accelerated the vulnerability. So I think in terms of pandemic and the number of threats we're seeing, there's a direct correlation. I think it has increased exponentially. The pandemic has really sped the whole vulnerability from that perspective. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think, based on what you and Louise, if I can bring us to concluding remarks, based on what you and Louise and Sajeev have said, when you get threat intel tools, for example, from our friends at Kaspersky, it really emphasizes the point that your eyesight is useless if your insight is blind. You have to have a lot of context around that threat intel feeds, which is where I highly, highly recommend these conversations go forward with Kaspersky. So with that, I'm going to thank Louise and Sajeev, ask you to stay on. And before I conclude this, I'm going to turn it over to Claire. Claire, thank you so much for your insights. If our audience wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do it? Cyberexchange.ca for one, but are there any other white papers or recommendations or data points that you want to point them to? Claire?
Yeah, so we release annual fraud reports. We're actually going to move that to quarterly now, in light of the fact that the scams are changing so rapidly in light of the pandemic. It's kind of this whole new context that the fraudsters now have. So please go to our Kaspersky KFP website, which I think is in the on the platform, and also we have SecureList as well, which is Kaspersky's research team, where you can read more about this. We release so many reports, so many white papers. So if there's any particular area that's of interest to you, I'm sure you will find on either of those two resources more information. And you're obviously all more than welcome to contact me as well. It's a subject that I'm obviously very passionate about, and will talk about in detail of any concerns anyone has, either from a business or a personal perspective.
Thank you so much, Claire. And Randy, last words to you. Hackers never sleep, and Randy never wastes his time lost in a dream. He is constantly available, always responsive. Randy, how can our audience get in touch with you, and any collateral you want to point them to?
Yeah, probably the best way to get a hold of me is through LinkedIn. I'm very active on social media, and you can find me there. I believe my contact information is also on the Kaspersky North America website. As far as pointing people in the direction of collateral, for our corporate friends, if you're securing a corporate environment, SecureList is where we publish a lot of our threat intelligence that's free. And very informational. It's our research driven by our global research and analysis team, the great team. But also on the consumer side, which is a big part of our business, you can follow us on social media. We're constantly publishing information like how to stay safe when you're gaming, a whole series of articles for gamers, down to our timely stuff. Like we published an article on how to safely leverage online dating platforms, around Valentine's Day. Yep. So, very active on the education side, looking to educate, both our corporate customers as well as the public in general.
Absolutely. And if you really want to get even more wisdom from Randy, watch his Power Hour. The man was dropping wisdom like liquid and did a phenomenal job explaining to us what Kaspersky does. We've come to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard and to the end of our time. To our audience, thank you for joining in. But before I thank you, Claire, Sajeev, Randy, Louise, please stay on. But I also want to thank you again for giving me an hour of your time and trusting me with this. I also want to thank you for supporting the Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Conference and really imbibing that theme of choose to challenge and making sure that your language, but more importantly your thought, remain very, very inclusive. So thank you so much. Please stay on. And to our audience, in the next 30 minutes, for the next 30 minutes, you can watch a whole bunch of advertisements. You can connect with different folks on cyberexchange.ca. And at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard, the session Cyber Literacy for Youth, a phenomenal session with very experienced individuals, will be taking place. I invite you to join that. I hope you all got some very important and useful information from this session. I've said this repeatedly, right? That this isn't about how can we eliminate danger or eliminate risk. This is about reducing that risk. And we're constantly playing that game of reducing our risk. And I hope all of you understood, just as I challenged myself at the start, nobody is too small of a target. And more importantly than that, when nobody's too small of a target, you need to know what resources are available to you, and you need to proactively prepare. As the saying goes, Noah didn't build the ark when it was raining. That was called proactive planning. Make that a part of your engagements when you work online. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you at the next session at 1 p.m. Take care and stay safe.